But you talk to people around the Sabres, and Kekalainen is impacting the culture there and is, I suppose, giving them some sort of like moxie that they were lacking in the Adams era.
2, 3, 4. Let me tell you about PuckPedia, stats, contracts, and caps. It's all there for you. One-stop shop for your hockey information. It's a hockey sensation. So log on, log on, log on. If you give a puck, go to PuckPedia.com.
Welcome to episode 34 of the PuckPedia Hockey Show. Today we have on a very special guest. It's the Score's John Matisz. John, how are we doing today?
Doing well, Keith. Just at the Score headquarters, only here roughly once a week to shoot our YouTube show. It's called Top Shelf. Check it out if you're interested. And yeah, there's firings, there's hirings. The league has set itself on fire here down the stretch in terms of personnel. So lots to cover.
Lots to cover indeed. I did actually just shoot GM Tom Fitzgerald, former GM Tom Fitzgerald, a text this morning just to, check in, see how he's
Sure.
doing. And seems like spirits are high as they could be, given the situation. And all rumors are pointing to him, getting a chance at that Nashville Predators opening. So we'll see how all that plays out. Interesting time in the NHL indeed. But before we kind of get into the current state of the league, and we'll also talk about the Halo conference that John moderated, a panel with Mike Kelly, Megan Chaika, and Aaron Ward. But John, why don't we get into just your background a little bit, how you got into writing specifically in the sport of hockey, and why you've kind of stayed at the Score for so long. I think you've been there about 7+ years at this point.
Yeah, so I was like the classic university student that had no idea what they were doing, taking business classes. Like I think I was geography to start, and I was just kind of all over the place. Just knew I wanted to go to university, both for the social aspect, but also to get a degree. And then one day I happened to bump into a family friend on campus who worked at the school newspaper, and they just met, like, they knew sort of my background of loving hockey growing up, of being, I suppose, an articulate writer. And she just said, hey, like, just try it out and see what happens. And it's hard to explain, Keith, and I don't know if this has happened to you, maybe in this career that you have, or in some other aspect of your life, but it just sort of hit me as a tidal wave in terms of like my interest. Like my motivation just went like this in terms of, oh, this is something I like. It's something I'm good at. I finally have like a direction for my, potential future career. So that was in like my third year of university, and I was there. I was ended up being there for 5 years, but I just like head down, was obsessed with journalism, was obsessed with figuring out how to interview people, how to write a good story. This was 2010-ish, 2009 maybe. So newspapers, the physical newspaper was still a thing. Although,
Some of our viewers
yeah,
are going to wonder what that is.
although on its way out, don't get me wrong. So I just went full on, and like if anyone listening is in that age, like the early 20s when you're at university, like really just try to make yourself marketable in terms of like employers will really appreciate if you've gone above and beyond. Like it's one thing to get a degree, but it's like do extracurriculars, blog if you want to get into media, podcast if you want to get into media. Just doing it, the content isn't even as important as just doing it, getting those reps, and also showing potential employers that like I mean business and I'm passionate about this and I'm trying to get better at my craft. So I went full on into that, and then got an internship right out of school after working at the school newspaper, and then kind of parlayed that into my first job, which was covering the London Knights of the OHL in London, Ontario. I was there for 2 years. I moved papers to a bigger one at one point, and then I'm like, hey, I got to get to an NHL market. I got to get to Toronto. Obviously, me being based in Ontario, that's kind of the go-to. And so I took an online editing job where I would edit copy and update the website of the Toronto Sun, and was there for a number of years. And again, sort of looked at it as, okay, what can I control here? And part of it was sort of what I can do on the side. I had a very good editor that I really, I guess, nurtured me in terms of, I was able to start my own podcast under the Toronto Sun brand and the Post Media brand, the parent company. And I was able to do a bunch of freelance work. And I really just grinded away for a couple of years there to build up my stature in terms of being in NHL locker rooms and writing, I suppose, league-wide trend pieces is how I would describe most of my work during that time. And then someone from the Score reached out and said, hey, we have an opening for basically a senior hockey writer what are your thoughts? And then I ended up, because I wanted to be a writer full time and I wasn't at that moment, it was a pretty big opportunity, especially because the Score would take me out of sort of the newspaper realm and put me in, working for essentially a mobile app. Like I wanted to be more on the cutting edge in terms of the technology, in terms of the presentation, in terms of the types of people you are writing for. So that was in 2008, and I've been here since, and you know, started and ended podcasts, worked on multiple major projects, and been consistently writing. And Keith, I'm sure you can relate to this, where say even 5 years ago, people's attention spans were way better than they are now. So my writing has changed in terms of the length of the stories, in terms of how quickly I get to the point in the stories, because you need to grab people's attention so quickly these days, unfortunately. Like, if we're being honest, um, just the social media era has really taken hold of everyone's lives, and so you just have to adapt. But that's the long and short of it in terms of me ending up at the Score. And yeah, I believe June would be 8 years in my
Wow.
current role. Yeah.
Yeah, they say adapt or die, right? Is
Yep.
like the mentality, and so I think that's interesting. And not to pump the Score up too much, but that's my go-to app to check all the games because
Yep.
I just think it does such a better job than like the ESPNs of the world or the NHL apps of the world. Like it just doesn't track the scores and just you can't get the information as quickly as you can on the Score. So really
Well, hold
appreciate
on.
that.
Let me clip this and send it to my boss, and then we'll continue.
Perfect. But I do want to bring up that part where you say adapt and die. Well, yeah, you have to adapt basically. So, like, your writing at the beginning of your career probably was more longer form. Like, you're trying to really build out these stories and you're taking a lot of information, a lot of different sources to kind of combine it. Where now you kind of have to get really, quick because if you don't post it within the first, let's call it 24 hours, like, there's already 15, 20 other people talking about it. It's already lost its luster. Like, even today, if you're talking about the Devils letting go of GM Tom Fitzgerald, like, if you're just getting the story out now, 12 hours after it happened, you already kind of missed the boat a little bit. So, how has your writing kind of adapted? You mentioned like getting to the point quicker in stories, shortening the length of stories. Like, how's all that played out?
Yeah, part of it is like just I suppose a company wide change in terms of like, okay, let's lean on the quantity more than the quality, and sort of change to the way that we weight that equation. So part of it is just, hey, I'm part of a features team. Hey, features team, let's pump out some more articles, and obviously that will impact each article in its own way, right? In terms of length, in terms of how many people you're talking to for it. A lot of my features involve talking to sources, whether it's on the record or off the record, and stringing things together. I do a lot more. How would I describe this? I guess notebook style stories than I used to. I used to at the beginning of my tenure at the Score was a lot of, I suppose you could say, like magazine style
Like
profiles.
more polished as
Yeah,
opposed to
and
like
just like deep
notebooks.
dives,
Yeah.
and just like one narrative throughout. Whereas now, for example, I do this bi-weekly column called NHL Inbox, which is, a mixture of reader questions, like kind of mailbag questions, of sort of my own takes, and then of like sort of hot topics, and I'm asking my sources about it. And that format is very, note, like all of them are under 300 words. And that's just how people consume things, right? So I suppose I could write 10 stories at 300 words each, but that's not super appealing. It makes more sense to group them all together and to have some sort of bite-sized items for people to chew on as they read through. And it also allows you to appeal to many different fan bases, right? So if I write a story that has 10 different items, in our, sort of back end, we're gonna tag 10 different teams if I mention 10 different teams. And then a big thing at the Score is the alert system, where every story, every breaking news piece is alerted to certain fan bases. So that's a part of it too. And I just think overall, it's just been a pivot also for myself of realizing, what do I consume? How often am I reading a longer form story? I don't get me wrong, I still love that stuff, but there needs to be some sort of agility there. And also, and this is sort of related, but it's also more of a side note, the way that NHL locker rooms and NHL coverage has changed over my career is notable, where every team has a beat writer that works for the team. Every scrum is recorded and posted to the team website. There's a lot more social media behind the scenes content being produced by teams, and all this is good stuff. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's like technically competition. So it's like, okay, what's my niche? What people working for independent outlets like myself can do is lean into the analysis more. Like I still do cherish my locker room availabilities and having access to players and coaches and managers, but there's less of a I suppose like a niche of doing like a behind the scenes story because these guys are being followed by cameras all the time, right? So that's been a pivot as well, is sort of leaning more into analysis and also just I suppose being a little more mainstream in my coverage. Whereas if you were to go back and read my stuff from 2018, some of it is not not really like off the beaten path is maybe the wrong way to put it, but it's maybe more like me really trying to find a unique angle when sometimes people just want to read, what is being talked about online or just what's in the zeitgeist.
Exactly. I think it's important to put yourself in the shoes of your audience and understand kind of what they want to listen to. And then to your point as well, with the more behind the scenes access, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because the teams are covering these players and the coaches, and all the press conferences are getting posted on team YouTube pages, on the website. Like, it's good that you're getting all that coverage, but I think it's interesting because you're like, my new angle is the analysis piece, because a lot of these teams' PR engines will not allow them to really dive deeper. It's more just covering the objective facts of the matter. So that's kind of where you can then take that information and really kind of give a deeper analysis that the teams are not allowed to do and they have no interest in doing. Do you have any good, interesting, locker room stories? Just like one time where
Hmm.
something just like really pops out to you and you were just like, this is cool, either from a player, from a coach, from a staff member, from another beat writer. Like, I think we had, Eric Engels on about a month or two ago, and he was telling this cool story about Carey Price, when he had a shutout when the team was, they were in a bad stretch, and he basically was giving credit to everyone else, even when they weren't doing well. He was getting all the blame. He didn't want to take the credit in like a great game that he had. So anything like that?
Nothing jumps out to me like off the top of my head, and I don't want to I guess pass along a bad story. I'm sure there's things that are there, but I can't think of them. But I guess I could share like a more on the embarrassing end of things, in terms of being a young writer and maybe just overdoing it. I mentioned before, like putting your nose to the grindstone and like really working earlier in your career to make a name for yourself. At one point when I was at the Toronto Sun, I was going to the rink and I was interacting with people and just working on stories here and there. And I had talked to Ray Ferraro, who obviously, ex player, really respected broadcaster, like someone that to some extent I looked up to. And we had talked on the phone about it was a story I did about analysts that are in between the benches and how like unique that position is and sort of like their stories between there and just it's the best seat in the house, that kind of story. And we had talked on the phone, and then so I saw him at the rink and I sort of introduced myself, and he gave me this look when I was introducing myself, like sort of like kind of like a puzzled look. And this was at like the intermission, I think, of the Leafs game. I'd had a really long day. Like I'd woken up at like 6 a.m. that day. Like I was just, really grinding in maybe in an unhealthy way. And I realized as he was giving me the puzzling look that I had a bag of popcorn and it was just spilling out as I was introducing myself. And then so it was like this embarrassing moment where, it's just like that classic sort of networking thing where you're like, hey, nice to meet you. We talked on the phone. And meanwhile, Ray and anyone who knows his sort of style on air is like, he's sarcastic and dry sometimes and likes to needle people. And he's like, eventually was like, you want to handle, that popcorn spilling out? And then I just like flustered and I like tripped over myself.
Oh man.
So there's, there's some humbling moments in terms of like, um, you realize that like, you do need to take care of yourself. Because that was definitely a moment where afterwards I'm like, why was I acting like that? What's wrong with me? Because I was just, not sleeping enough and just caring so much about, producing content and just being out there that it's like sometimes you just need to take a break, because then there'll be an incident where, you feel like, and it's happened other times where it's like you're at a press conference and you're asking the coach a question and it comes out completely wrong. And it's probably because you just didn't think about it before. Your mind was elsewhere. So, funnily enough, my mind goes towards that Ray Ferraro anecdote versus something that happened in the dressing room. I'm sure I have a few stories, but they're not coming to mind immediately.
No, that's great. And to your point too, like sometimes you're grinding so hard that your mind is just going in a million different
Yes.
directions, and sometimes it's hard to take a step back and really singularly focus on what you need to with the moment at hand. You mentioned a piece about networking, so that's a perfect transition into kind of the Halo conference that was in Colorado last week. So the Hockey Analytics League operations, the Colorado Avalanche were kind enough to host basically 31 to 32 NHL teams had representation there from their front office and analytics department. We had media members there. We had students there presenting their hackathons. And then we just had other people that were interested in the event. I think over 300 people total. John was, great enough to moderate the panel that had Mike Kelly, Megan Chaika, and Aaron Ward. So Mike works for Teamworks, so that's Sport Logic. Megan has co-founded Stathletes, and then Aaron Ward is with SMT, and basically talking about data providers and how different ways that they capture data, how teams use their analytics specifically, where they think the future of that is going. So John, why don't you talk us through a little bit just what it was like to moderate that panel, what information you kind of took away as someone who's not necessarily in the analytics space, but definitely helpful for you to understand the context of that as you're writing some of these articles and understanding the new thinking of hockey.
Yeah, I think one of my major takeaways, considering I had the privilege of talking to three people from three big players in that analytics tech space, is that all three are doing slightly different things. In terms of SMT, they basically are providing the data that produces the NHL Edge website. You got Stathletes has really leaned into the content game in terms of their partnership with ESPN, in terms of betting companies doing some work with them, and obviously they do have teams that they work with, and they are plugged into that side of things. But there's clearly been a focus on the media side of things, and then Sport Logic is actually a company that I've worked with, um, in terms of like I have an agreement with them where I get certain data from them for my coverage. So I've already known kind of how they operate, but they are obviously a big player in the space, and I really appreciate the sorts of metrics that they are able to spit out from their tracking. But I mean, it's interesting, right, Keith? Like the there's been such an evolution here where, and the way that I like to look at it is that we used to care a lot about Corsi, and then now, like I obviously it's helpful knowing what the shot attempts are, but like expected goals is above and beyond in so many ways in terms of adding context. So then now it's a matter of, okay, how can we make expected goals a better metric, a more reliable metric, a metric that captures even more of what's going on the ice in terms of the different variables. And so that's a big part of it for me, is like seeing the evolution and also seeing some things go out of vogue that were previously pretty popular. And I think it's mostly a group understanding or an industry wide understanding that there are better ways to do this, and then leaving the past in the past in terms of Corsi versus expected goals. And then I'm wondering what's next. Goaltending I think is still a pretty untapped market in terms of our understanding of it. I think that goals saved above expected, and I use the Sport Logic, uh, I guess, model for goals saved above expected a lot in my writing and in my coverage on video and podcast. I think it's very good, but I think that there's still room to grow in that space. And maybe also in other ways, it's just the most unpredictable position in sports, and who knows if we'll ever get a firm grasp on it. But and then there's actually one thing that's really sort of exciting me moving forward is the passing data, where, and this is one thing I brought up with Megan on the panel, was, hey, you're tracking passing data, but is there any way that we can better incorporate it into expected goals models? Because a Nikita Kucherov pass is, light years better than an average NHLer pass in terms of, you could have the player in the same spot that's pulling the trigger on the ice. He can be, uncovered, a great spot, but like that pass from Kucherov is going to put him in a much better situation than that pass from an average NHLer. So how do we quantify that? How do we mix that variable into the equation and just become smarter as a hockey community? Because that's all this is, right? Like there's a lot of infighting, whether it's in the analytics community or just between, pro analytics people and anti analytics people. But like at the end of the day, this is all information. it's all data points that can help you understand the game better. And I love that there's two aspects of it where you've got the team side, what teams are doing with it, and then the fan slash media side. You know, how's it being presented? How what are fans learning in 2026?
Yeah, you brought up so many like good different points that we could kind of take this next step to the conversation a bunch of different ways. Like you look at some of like what we're seeing online, like when people are posting the public models, like you mentioned, right? The public models is generally just has shot location, maybe the angle and the type of shot, but it doesn't really have, the player and puck tracking data. So where the players are positioned, if the goalie's screened, things like that, but also like what happened pre-shot movement that a lot
Mhm.
of these private companies like a Sportlogic or a Stathletes is starting to incorporate. And then two, I think it's interesting because each team operates so differently, right? So each team might use Sportlogic's expected goal model. They might make their own expected goal model because they don't necessarily agree with all the inputs or
Mhm.
they want to add their own things that they're doing with whatever computer vision kind of, predictive models, data analysis, science, things like that. So there's just a lot of different ways, and then how each front office structures their analytics department is totally different. Some teams just have more like a couple people that are focused on the analysis side of things. Other people have 5 to 10 people, and like they have software developers and engineers, so they're really building their own internal tools and systems. And it's just going to be interesting, like you said, to see what happens in the next few years. I think passing is definitely one piece of the puzzle that people would like to understand, and defense too. I think defense is a little bit harder to track. And some of these great metrics that Sportlogic spits out, like stick checks and puck battles won and zone exits and recoveries and things like that, is kind of helping inform decisions. But to your point too, analytics rubs people the wrong way sometimes. And it's really just information, right? It's just all this data. And then what you do with that is kind of the next step. So I think there's context to every situation. And it's really that battle between these smart analytics people and these like, older, let's call them front office people, hockey people who aren't necessarily analytically driven. And you're really trying to get them to buy in and to get an organizational philosophy that you can make sense out of, because some of these people just having these conversations with some of these people, sometimes it's a battle to get the leadership to get on board with some of the information. Even if it is good information, it's how you communicate that, and I think that's kind of part of the challenge too.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different philosophies in terms of how much should you incorporate the data into your decision making, into your coaching. I mean, as you saw in Colorado, Keith, like the Avalanche are pretty invested. Whether it's Bednar in terms of what he's taking in between periods as far as data and then relaying it to his team, or in between games, how is the data helping him break down what's going well and what's going not so well with his team. And it's nice to hear Bednar. And obviously, if people want to listen, the Hockey PDO did a full interview with him at the conference, so check that out in your podcast feed. It's very informational and instructive. But the one thing that always puzzled me about coaches being maybe anti-analytics or just not like fully embracing it, or at least half embracing it, is that I feel like there's such a synergy there. There's such an overlap where coaches are these people that are in the weeds. They're, grinding video. They want to know like the minutia. And guess what? Some of these companies, let's just say Sportlogic, because I'm familiar with what they can produce. If you want to talk about the other team's forecheck, you can, put together a whole mixtape of how they forecheck. But it's certainly helpful if you're a player and you're being instructed on like how to do any sort of how to basically defend the forecheck. If you have also a couple of data points where it's like, hey, this team forechecks this way and they are fourth in the league in this metric, and you obviously don't want to overload them with a bunch of information, but it can match the eye test in a really strong way, where I feel like there was a serious I don't know, threat being felt by coaches. And this is more like 10 years ago. I think most of them have come around, but where it seemed to be a butting of heads, where it's like the data can't tell me how to coach. I'm the hockey person. I know how this works. Whereas it's a matter of marrying the two. It's a matter of, I guess, being more productive in your meetings too, and being more efficient, and also just getting your message across in a more effective way. So that was always something that kind of bothered me, going back 10, 15 years, where I felt like coaches should be completely embracing this because there's so much overlap between video and what's collected by these companies. And the sooner you sort of dive into that and figure out ways to utilize the data in your coaching, the better off you'll be. And at this point, I don't know if there's a better uh, example of sort of embracing it than Jared Bednar in Colorado.
Yeah, 100%. And I was actually listening to Elliot Friedman on 32 Thoughts that came out yesterday, and he was mentioning the Halo conference too. And he was saying a lot of people weren't aware that it was happening. Although, I guess if you're in the space, like I saw constant, reminders and kind of posts from Eric and crew. So I knew it was happening, obviously. But I think one interesting thing he mentioned was that, and it goes back to your head coaching point, is that Scotty Bowman in like the 70s was literally manually tracking puck battles. So he basically he was using analytics in the 70s before it was quote unquote analytics, right? He's getting these data points and he's manually watching the game and he's saying, this guy's good at puck battles, this guy's not good. Like, how do we, take that information and use it to be better?
No, puck battles is such a good example where even as recently as 5 years ago, it just wasn't a metric, and now you have it. And like, say, take Macklin Celebrini. A big reason why everyone's obsessed with this kid and his trajectory is because he is such a dog on a bone with the puck, and he's so assertive out there. And sure, we could watch, at Sharks games, till we're blue in the face kind of thing. And obviously there's mixtapes out there of him doing his thing, but it's also helpful to just look at the leaderboard of puck battle wins and go, this is crazy. This guy's 19. Even when last year, this guy's 18 and he's whatever, top 10 in puck battle win percentage. Like it confirms what you're seeing with your eye and almost gives you, I suppose, a more accurate representation of how good that player is at a certain thing or how poorly in some instances. So I think it's just a no brainer that coaches have, the smart ones have really embraced it and really brought it into their day to day. And I just think in general, like even it's crazy how quickly these things snowball. Like 2 years ago, I did this big sort of deep dive on the analytics movement in the NHL in terms of like, okay, this was right before Eric Tulsky got hired as GM of the Hurricanes. And it was basically just recapping the 10 years prior where, okay, teams started to get interested in bringing on consultants and analysts on a part-time basis around like 2014. And then the story I published was around, 2024. So it was a sort of, okay, recapping what happened over the last 10 years. And a big takeaway was just the sheer number of employees in the NHL now that are data, to use Keith Pelly's word, data centric.
Yeah.
It was crazy. It was like, there was like 15 or something in 2014. 2024 was like 130. And some of this is natural. Like, there's this movement. And, obviously people are going to jump on board at different stages in terms of this team being, really forward thinking, this team not being so progressive, but then eventually coming on board. But what amazes me is that was just 2 years ago, and it was, I don't have the number exactly, but something like 130 people who work in the NHL for teams in a data role. Now it's around 200. Like it just keeps going up, and obviously artificial intelligence really breaking through into the mainstream. It's been around for a while, but that being such a big talking point in any industry in terms of how it's going to affect the economy, how it's going to replace jobs, etc. Like hockey analytics, sports analytics, they're right in the middle of that in terms of how can you be more productive as an analytics department? How can we use essentially, how can we use these AI tools to better, analyze the game and better collect data and better store data and all these other things. And I think that there will be an advantage to the teams that fully embrace AI in the way that there was a big advantage for the early adopters of analytics. Like I feel like this is now another wave of like, okay, who's going to be on the cutting edge? So teams that are weary right now are maybe going to be left behind in a couple years when the teams that were all over AI and weren't getting their backs up over like the moral part of it. The fact that it is coming and is here and it's just going to exponentially take over. You don't have to like it, but it's going to happen kind of thing. So those teams that are dialed in right now, I think are going to really benefit down the road.
Yeah, and I've heard some examples in the NFL where teams are using AI to talk about formations, play, which play should we run given this down, this score, like things like that, like situationally. And I could see a lot of similar examples being, passed on to the NHL. Why don't we shift gears a little bit here? And I think you brought up a good point with the whole Keith Pelly data centric mindset. And so I want to talk about your current thoughts on the NHL and just to that point too, where MLSC let go of GM Brad Tree Living, and Keith Pelly had the press conference the following day saying we want to bring on a leadership group that is more kind of data centric. So whether that was taking a shot at Tree Living, I don't know exactly how to take what he's saying, but at the same time, there had to be a disconnect in the Maple Leaf organization where they're one of the most analytically driven teams. Looking at their staff and how many people they have in those roles, and like Daryl Metcalf was there in person with a few other Toronto Maple Leafs staff, and he's like one of the kind of founding members of this analytic movement. So it was interesting to hear that. But let's just hear about your take on the NHL this season. We obviously had a couple coaching fires in the last couple weeks, a couple GM firings, one yesterday and one last week as well. So a lot of moving parts. And then we have a great kind of rush towards the end of the season. The Eastern Conference is still all jumbled with a few playoff spots up for grabs. The Western Conference is more down to one or two spots, but we should be shaping up for a great Stanley Cup playoff. And, look at the Central Division. We're going to have an incredible matchup there. So why don't you take us through just what's caught your eye this season in the NHL?
Well, I would say, like, if we're just really going sort of big picture, the full season, I think it's very much been a changing of the guard season as far as Matthew Schaefer, Connor Bedard, maybe to a lesser extent, and Macklin Celebrini really leveling up in a significant way. Obviously, Schaefer, we didn't even know what to expect, but he just incredible season, like arguably the best 18-year-old defenseman season of all time.
The fact that he
And
was in the mix for the Olympics just says it all.
and should have been there if we're being honest, like in
Yep.
hindsight, given Canada's struggles on the back end. So that is it mixed with sort of like the changeover in the Atlantic, and just the standings have been, you mentioned it, like there's still a lot unsettled in both conferences. But I feel like it's like, if I were to put sort of a headline or a title on the season, it's almost a changing of the guard type of campaign, with the sort of caveat that it's also super interesting to see a team like Pittsburgh, where you've got Crosby, Malkin, Letang, who isn't having as good of a season as the other two, and then Carlson uh, being sort of the core, the nucleus of this sort of rebuilding, retooling, whatever you want to call it,
Who's the
thing
GM of
happening.
the Pittsburgh Penguins, by the way?
Yeah, Kyle Dubas, who, ironically would be a great candidate for the Leafs job, given the description that Keith Pelly laid out the other day. But yeah, it's fascinating. Like it really seems like a change of the guard season, and that leads obviously to Pete DeBoer getting hired by the Islanders, where I think people get really caught up in the 4 games left in the season, and rightfully so. Like, it's very kind of uncommon, and just if you're thinking about it logically, it's kind of a random time to make a coaching change. But if you look at it from Pete DeBoer's perspective, I mean, he's hitching his wagon to Matthew Schaefer, and he was going to be a top free agent as a coaching candidate, as Matthew Darsh mentioned in the press conference. He is, or I guess was, the top coaching free agent. So that tells you that he has the pick of 5 or 6 teams probably. And I don't know if the Islanders, I don't know if there's another team that would be higher than the Islanders in terms of, like, you've got Schaefer, Sorokin, and obviously some other good pieces, but like a team headed in the right direction, a new GM that seems pretty smart coming out of the Tampa organization, and you get a nice long contract, and you go from there. Like, it's fascinating from that perspective.
The deal's also aligned with Matthew Darsh's deal, so it kind of
There we
runs at
go.
the same time, and it's a little different because this is more of a long-term play where
Yes.
Tortorella to Vegas is just through the rest of the season, then kind of see what happens. Like, Matthew Darsh basically made the bet where he's like, I didn't have my guy, right? My quote unquote guy in the head coaching job. He's not the long-term role. Let's get the best free agent guy. If we make the playoffs, great. If we don't, no big deal. We got another 3-year runway with this.
Well, and one thing I've been thinking about recently is sort of like the different kinds of coaches for different parts of your competitive timeline. So if I can just throw a couple names out there, like Don Granado, that's you got to rebuild.
That's a
You give him a
rebuilder.
call, and you interview him, see what he thinks about handling teenagers and guys in their early 20s and developing them. That's a guy you might want to consider. If you're at the spot where it's the Islanders clearly have a cornerstone in Schaefer, have some other good pieces, a guy like Cal Ritchie coming through the pipeline, like they are on the up and up. You want a floor raising coach, and that is exactly what Pete DeBoer is, in terms of bringing in a certain structure, being a tactician, and like, he has tons of evidence from what is he on his he's on a sixth spot. Like
They go
every
to the
place he's
conference final every time he goes.
there's that, and even just like whenever he arrives, it's kind of like what Peter Laviolette used to be. Whenever he arrives in a place, you get that new coach bump, and it's not a coincidence. It's sort of a correlation there between the coaching style and getting the best out of your team. Now, there's an endpoint to these types of coaches, right? The floor raisers, or most of them, where like, I don't know. Let's just say if we put Tortorella in the same bucket,
They get fired, right? Like
they get fired.
they have like a shelf life of 3 years and then they get let go.
Exactly, the voice gets old. Maybe whatever they're trying to institute doesn't get through their players, or I find a lot of them are not necessarily testy with the media, but like every once in a while, obviously Tortorella is, but the other guys in this category, not necessarily testy with the media, actually quite pleasant, but every once in a while they'll like throw a player under the bus, and that kind of creates turmoil. And that, like, obviously Pete
Torts
DeBoer
is
and
getting a little less testy, I'd say, in his older
yeah,
age.
that's fair. And so with DeBoer, obviously Jake Ottinger famously was blamed for the playoff exit last year. So I find like that's another tier. You've got your rebuilding sort of development coaches, you've got your floor raisers, and then you've got your sort of franchise coaches, Bednar, Cooper,
Mhm.
Carberry, I think, is one in Washington. I don't think he's going anywhere anytime soon, even if they have
Yeah.
a down year. Like he's there. And the key with those guys is they have strong alignment with the front office, and the front office has security. And it's almost like when you show up to play for that team, like they're a part of the fabric. Like they're not going anywhere anytime soon. And they also tend to have a way of working with star players, of deploying, lines the right way. If you think of John Cooper and sort of what he brings to the table, it's less X's and O's, less tactician sort of magic, and more the human touch, but also have to be, good enough in those sort of hockey areas, if you will, to stick around that long. So, if you're a GM, like let's just say there was a team that was starting a big scorched earth rebuild tomorrow, I think you could think about it, if you had the security as a GM, you could think about it as like, I'm going to go through 3 coaches before we challenge for the cup. And it's kind of crazy to think that, because you hope the first guy you hire is the guy you always work with, but like we
It
have enough evidence
rarely
over
is.
yeah, we have enough evidence over the salary cap era, let's say, that like the turnover is a thing for a reason.
Yeah, it is crazy. Like the coaches and the GMs and the people in front offices, they keep getting recycled, right? And you're looking at guys like DeBoer, who's on his 6th coaching job. Tortorella's been, a handful of teams, and then Bruce Cassidy just got let go for Tortorella, and he's probably going to find himself as a new head coach by the start of next season. So that whole aspect is definitely interesting. Well, John, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time here. We're going to wrap it up with one final question. It's kind of in the same vein here. What's been your biggest surprise in the NHL this season? To me, there's a few things that pop out to mind. I think the Pittsburgh Penguins, being second in the Metro, seemingly pretty easily clinching a playoff spot, when in the offseason they were the quote unquote only sellers out there, and all 31 other teams were supposed to be buying. We got Anaheim also in the Western Conference getting a nice bump as well. Toronto and Florida on the negative end of it. But to me, I think Buffalo is kind of the big, cool sticking point there. They're going to make the playoff for the first time in over 15 seasons. They're now, the New York Jets are the longest tenured playoff team to miss the playoffs in North America. And just kind of the shift that happened when Kevin Adams left, like that whole team is basically the same, minus a couple of small trade deadline ads, but they kind of just took off as soon as he left. And you almost wonder if Kevin Adams is going to be in the mix for a GM job, considering how good Buffalo looks now. But to you, John, what's been your biggest surprise just in the NHL this season?
I'm gonna stick with the Sabres in terms of not only that, not specifically them like becoming a playoff team, but I think them rising to the level that they are so quickly. And that sounds weird when you have a playoff drought for 14 years, but it's almost like that classic thing where it's like an overnight success that was actually a decade in the making. That seems to be an apt way of describing the Sabres, where you had Jason Botterill, acquired Darlene and Thompson. They're 2 best players at forward D. And then you've got Kevin Adams, I believe, out of the 26 guys on their team right now, 20 were from Kevin Adams. Then you've got obviously Kekalainen coming in mid-season and adding 4 guys. Sam Carrick has been the only impact guy. But you talk to people around the Sabres, and Kekalainen is impacting the culture there, and is, I suppose, giving them some sort of moxie that they were lacking in the Adams era. So they're a team that's been knocking on the door for a number of years in terms of the playoffs, but I found that there was sort of a snowball effect where they would be down 1 or 2 goals in a game, and next thing you know, they're down 3 or 4. Just they didn't have sort of the fight in terms of their shoulders slumping and just thinking, "Oh, here we go again." And I think a lot of that was the drought just weighing on them. And I don't know if it's maturity in terms of like their leaders like Darlene and Thompson just saying, "Hey, enough is enough. This is not the year that we let this thing snowball in the wrong direction." It's actually gone the other way with how incredible they've been over the last 4 months. So there's a lot to unpack there with the Sabres and how it's gone and how they've been on this wild ride for the last 4 months. But overall, I'm just super impressed and fairly surprised in terms of like how much they've leveled up and the types of players that are making significant impacts, whether it's Zach Benson or Noah Oslin or Josh Doan or Matisz Samuelsson. Like it's a pretty deep team at this point, and we'll see if the goaltending holds up. But at this point, like they might be the favorite in their first round series, which is crazy to say about a team that's been sort of wandering in the abyss for a number of years here.
Yeah, they can probably line up against any of Detroit, Montreal, or Boston in their first round matchups. Depending on how it shakes out, they'll probably end up in Atlantic too. But to your point too, like the Josh Jones situation, like he was kind of almost like a throw in. I mean, not a throw in, but like he wasn't the main piece of that deal. It was
Yeah.
Kesselring, and then oh, we got Doan too. And then from day one, he's just been a really important culture piece, and just he's producing at a nice rate to then end up getting a pretty long term ticket at the end of this. And it's just been really cool to see. In Buffalo in the playoffs for the first time in 15 years, that city is going to be
Oh yeah.
electric. Just watching that barn in the playoffs, their first home playoff game is going to be absolutely nuts. So something to look forward to for hockey fans. Well, John, this has been great. Thank you so much. As you mentioned at the top, make sure you're tuned in to the Scores podcast. I believe you said Top Shelf is the
Top
name of it.
shelf. Yeah, go to
Yeah,
YouTube, the Score YouTube channel. Yep.
perfect. Well, John, thank you so much, and good luck with the rest of the season, and hopefully we get some good excitement in these playoffs in the next few weeks.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Keith.
PuckPedia.